Thank you for joining today's Family Services webinar. Our topic, as you can see, is discussing what matters most in planning for end-of-life care. And I want to start by just going over a few specifics of the Zoom webinar in case you're not familiar with it. So if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should see a black toolbar, and there is a Q&A button there. So if you have any questions for our presenter today, Kate, please feel free to submit those throughout the webinar as she's covering different topics. And if it's on topic, we'll get to it as we go. And if it's not, we might just hold it for the Q&A time at the end. You'll also see a chat button down there. So if you have any technical issues, please feel free to reach out over the chat. Or if Kate asks a question and you want to share a little response to the discussion we're having today, please also feel free to enter that in the chat. If you do use the chat, just make sure that it is set to go to all attendees or all panelists so that we can all see it. And then lastly, I just want to make sure everyone knows, so the Zoom webinar is a little bit different than a Zoom meeting, which I'm sure we've all experienced. Right now, you're all muted and there's no audio or no video. That's just to ensure we have a nice quiet background to be able to hear the presentation. But at the end of Kate's time, we'll open it up for Q&A. And if you have a question you'd like to ask, and you'd like to ask it over video, you can raise your hand and I will add you. There's an opportunity to add your video so that you can speak and actually ask a question. If you think it's something there may be more of a discussion or a little bit of dialogue about, we're happy to add your video to Kate and I so that we can all chat and discuss it in real time. And then lastly, I just want to remind everyone that today's webinar will be recorded, and Kate has some really great resources she's going to be sharing. So after the webinar, there'll be a link to the recording and also a link to her resources that will be sent out to attendees and available on the IFOPA website. So you'll be able to, if you're someone who likes to make sure you're taking in all the information, don't feel rushed to, scribble down notes. You'll be able to go back and review her slides and rehear everything from today later. So with that, I am so thrilled to be able to introduce Kate DeBartolo to the FOP community. So Kate is the Senior Director at the Conversation Project. She's based out of Washington, D.C. and has been working for the past 14 years with the Institute of Healthcare Improvement. So Kate's going to tell us more about the Conversation Project, the work they do. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, Kate, for joining us and for shedding light on what I know can be a very challenging topic to dive into sometimes. So thank you for making it more accessible for us and yeah, sharing your knowledge.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am calling in from DC. We have a very hot and humid week here, so I'm interested to hear where other people are calling in from today. I'm just so glad to be with you. I'll be sharing more about the Conversation Project, a lot of the free resources we have, some of the kind of tips and tricks we've learned from the field, and just hoping to have more of a conversation with you. So with that, I'm just going to share my screen here. And Hope, are you able to see everything there?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, great. So I thought that I would start by sharing my story. So here we're going to talk about wishes for care through the end of life. I actually hope that by the end of this, you won't see it as such a challenging topic to talk about and will feel prepared to have these conversations with people in your life. I'll share more about why advanced care planning is important to me. And I joke that I paid a lot for a wedding photographer like 8 years ago. And so I try to get as much use out of these photos as possible. But you can see a picture with my husband here in the lower left. His father died really unexpectedly at age 41 playing basketball, leaving 2 small children behind. And so he and I have had conversations about what we would want if something unexpected were to happen in our life. I've got a picture with my sisters in the upper right-hand corner. You can see the younger one is almost 20 years younger than I am, my father's second marriage. And he's now in a third marriage, and there's all sorts of blended family dynamics at play here. And so we really had to be sure that we're kind of all on the same page of who's responsible for what decisions, What does his new wife be responsible for? How would my sisters and I be up to speed on what's going on? And so particularly in blended families, it's all the more important to kind of be on the same page. And then in the bottom right, that's a picture of just my mom's family. She's one of 7. And that's not even all of them there, but it was amazing to me with the death of both of my grandparents, her parents, how much that entire family was all on the same page. That 7 adult children didn't have infighting between them about what would their parents want at a time when they couldn't speak for themselves, because they had talked about things so openly, and it was really clear kind of how decisions were going to be made. They couldn't talk about every medical scenario that played out, but they were all really on the same page as it came to values. And so those are just some of the examples for me about why this topic is so important and how I think it's really applicable to anybody over 18 and to normalize this with others. So that's just a little bit about me. I don't know if we could use the chat, or if people want to unmute themselves, just to spend a few minutes to get to know, I don't know, Hope, is the chat okay, of kind of your name, who are the people in your life? You know, I was just sharing examples to me of kind of who I'm accountable to, or who I think that I might be responsible for supporting. And just to get a little bit more information about why this call was of interest to you. So maybe we could pause for a minute. You can let me know what the best way to go about that would be.
Yeah, that's great. If people want to use the chat and share, whatever you feel comfortable with about, if you want to share your name, that's great. But if you just want to say why this webinar was of interest to you, or who, as Kate has here on the screen, who are the people in your life you're accountable to, or that you support if you're a caregiver, please, feel free to put it in the chat, and we can.
Hi, Holly. I will, as people are typing in, my hope is that by the end of this, if you thought you were joining just about your own wishes, or you thought you were joining as a caregiver because you want to elicit somebody else's wishes, I hope that you will leave this intending to do both. That no matter what your current situation is, that this is something that you would talk about what your wishes are for care with people in your life, and choosing a healthcare proxy, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so it's not just sharing, but how can you start to pull that out from other people who may think, oh, that's not for me yet, or we've got time. So I'm hoping that people will feel a little bit more prepared on both sides of that. Karen, a blended family, 2 stepdaughters. Haven't put that to this topic, but also a caregiver. Yes. Karen, you've got all of the bingo cards of blended family, caregiver for parents. You've got 3 generations right there that I can hear about that would be important to help normalize this. I will also say, we'll get into it, but I know that in this session, it's kind of talking about end-of-life care planning. I see so much of this is about, it's not conversations about how somebody wants to die. It's really conversations about how you want to live your life all the way through the end. And what are things that would be important for people to know about that in case there's a time where you can't speak for yourself. Holly saying, like, to start planning for the future. Celebration of life, pre-planning. That's great. I hope, Holly, today will be a little bit more specific to kind of wishes for care before the end of life. And then what we often find is a lot of people kind of get rolling and thinking about that, and it gets them to then think about, what would a celebration look like for me? What are the things I would want people to know? I know that when I've talked about this with my mom, we've been talking about healthcare, and then suddenly it'll come out. She's like, well, I hope if you have a party that people are drinking whiskey sours, because that's my favorite drink. Or here's a song that I particularly love if you were to play that at the ceremony. So sometimes by talking about these more medical things, some of the other celebration pieces come out as well. Thank you guys for, I'll keep trying to take a peek at the chat. I'm going to kind of keep that open for myself down here in the lower right-hand corner, so that if you have questions that come up, you can let me know. I am not going to share videos on today's call, but I just wanted to let you know that if you want to, you can take a look at this great ABC News piece that explains a little bit more about how the Conversation Project got started, kind of where we began, which was over 10 years ago now. Pulitzer Prize winning columnist Ellen Goodman, she's with the Boston Globe, had the experience in caring for her mother. She'd also helped care for her sister at the end of her life. But with her mother, where she felt like they had talked about so many things in their life, except for the kind of care that her mom would want to receive. And that she felt really unprepared for the kind of cascade of medical questions that started to come her way from the doctors, where she's, on deadline for an article and the doctors call and say, your mom has pneumonia. Do you want us to start antibiotics or not? And she was like, this is really turning into life or death questions, and I have no idea what my mom would have wanted, and I can't believe we didn't talk about this. So for her, it was a very personal realization that we need to normalize people having these conversations well before there's a crisis, so that it doesn't feel as scary, and so that people feel supported in having those conversations. And she talked to a lot of peers and friends, and came to IHI, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, where the Conversation Project is housed, and found that there tended to be a split between people who had experienced a quote unquote good death or a hard death, which was not to say that the death wasn't hard or emotional or difficult or that there was grief, but for people who had had conversations about this, the complexity of the grief wasn't as hard. And so I think about that example with my mom's family of, to have 7 adult siblings on the same page on something is actually pretty unique when you hear about different infighting that can happen. And that was also the goal to help avoid that. So there's a little bit more about us on that BBC clip. But our goal, we're generally a public engagement campaign to help people share their wishes for care through the end of life so that those wishes can be better understood and respected, whether that's by family, friends, medical providers, to just help get more people to be familiar with what matters most to us if there's a time where we couldn't speak for ourselves. So we know there's kind of these 2 key things of why we think that talking matters. And I want to say, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I'm going to particularly focus on conversations here and not just documentation. And while I think that documentation and filling out an advance directive or having a living will is super important, I don't think it does us much good if we have some document from 7 years ago in a filing cabinet that nobody knows about and hasn't spoken about. And so for us, it's really important to have these conversations so that people can ask follow-up questions, they can understand what our wishes are. So this idea that we can't plan for everything, but we can share what matters most to us with the people who matter most to us, and you can decide who that might be. Maybe it's biological family, maybe it's chosen family, we can think about who that would be. And that it kind of creates this foundation built on our values in case the time comes up where somebody might need to act on those. And for us, we think that discussing values and wishes can also bring us closer to people. We don't have any preference for the type of care somebody might choose. We just want them to be talking. So I just want to be very clear about that we have no kind of goals for what somebody's wishes can be. And that listening is a huge part of conversations as well. That we don't always need to immediately react to what somebody's wishes are. We don't always need to offer an opinion. We can just kind of acknowledge what somebody is telling us. I'll include a letter at the end of an example of somebody explaining how much by not trying to talk at somebody, but really listening to what's being told is important. And that sometimes just like listening is such a key part of somebody feeling heard. And in conversation. So I just really want to name that. And that there's a great quote here by Int'l, who some of you might be familiar with. He's a surgeon and a writer. He's written a lot of pieces for The New Yorker, and he has a book called Being Mortal, and has this great quote about how our ultimate goal, after all, is not a good death, but a good life till the very end. And that is our goal, is to transform how we live until the end. And we also know that not everyone is given the same opportunity for a good life. And we've seen inequities in racial disparities, socioeconomic disparities. COVID really laid bare the differences that people have in living life, and that not everyone has the luxury or privilege to think about a good death when they are struggling to live a good life, or to put food on the table, worrying about finances, cost of treatment, simply living in peace and not just dying in peace. And so part of our work is really to ensure that everyone is reached and listened to and respected, and don't want this work to create further inequities of care at the end of life, kind of who's receiving the kind of care that they wanted to receive and who isn't. So we have a website, conversationproject.org, with a lot of free downloadable resources and videos. I'm going to share with you a little bit more about the kinds of things that we have. These are examples of the guides that we have. So they're all free to download and print online. We have them in English, Spanish, and Chinese. And we also have an audio version, at least right now, of our conversation guide. We're starting to roll out audio versions in English of some of the other ones as well, in case that's easier for folks. And we're always kind of interested in hearing what topics might be helpful to hear other languages. So we have one on how to start the conversation, how to choose a healthcare proxy, or the advocate who might speak for you, how to be a healthcare proxy. So if somebody's asked you to be their proxy, what kind of things should you know, what questions to ask. We have a guide for how to talk to a healthcare team and what to do if you feel like the healthcare team's not really listening to what your wishes are. And then 2 caregiver guides, one for caregivers of folks with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, and then another one for caregivers of children with serious illness. Again, almost all of these aren't really about death or end of life only. It's really about the kind of care you want to receive now and in the future. And they really help set up kind of a groundwork in case there's a time where you can't speak for yourself. How could we be sure that a lot of people know what matters most to you? We also worked with a group called Ariadne Labs to create a guide for people living with serious illness. So that's a great tool to take a look at, of kind of how to think about what matters most to me in living with a serious illness, so that I can make a plan and talk about it. So again, that one's not end of life specific, but it's really about living with serious illness. And then there's kind of a quick guide of being prepared in COVID. That's something that we created in April 2020, and unfortunately continues to still be an important resource for folks. We also have a lot of stories on our website, tons of blogs. You can see this example of like somebody who wrote a piece about, please trim my chin hairs. If I'm ever in a position where I can't do that, here are the things that matter most to me. But also a lot of really amazing kind of sharing of stories. And we work with a lot of community champions. So we work with hundreds or thousands of individuals and organizations just like this, who are trying to reach people where they live, work, pray, learn. So if this is something that you're interested in, we've got groups all over the country that are doing more to, again, kind of normalize this as kind of a culture shift. It's been really exciting for us to see the age demographics of who's been paying attention to the Conversation Project and how that's changed over the last decade. So now it's like under 35 is our largest growing demographic. And so that to me shows that we're kind of doing a better job of reaching people earlier. So that's a little background on us, but wanted to use this opportunity to kind of talk about you guys on the line today and have a chance to kind of see some of the content that we have and to practice or think about questions you might have. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the inside of our conversation starter guide, and I would love if folks want to use the chat. You can stream of conscious, tell us what you're thinking, and we can have time at the end. But what we generally open up with is a really open-ended question. You can think about what your answers are. So the first question that we have is, what matters most to me through the end of my life is, and you can fill in the blanks. And I'll share with you a couple of examples of, we've seen everything from, chin hairs, or please be sure that my feet aren't tucked into the sheets because that really drives me crazy and I can't stand that, to it's really important for me to have the end of life be peaceful or pain-free, or success to me is being in the hospital with excellent nursing care. There can be a wide range of kind of the types of answers that people might have. And when we've asked people for their answers, we pulled together this kind of word cloud of the most common responses that we've seen. And you can see here the larger the word, the more often it was brought up. And that there's very little that is medical, clinical, legal about the terms that people are using. And so I don't know if any of these phrases or terms resonate with you, but that's the kind of thing we're trying to get at, kind of like what matters most to you here. And then to think about certain questions. So we think that having a say in the kind of care that you're going to have is more likely if you've shared how you feel about certain situations that could arise now and in the future. And that there's no way to think about every hypothetical medical scenario that could play out, and you shouldn't. You know, like it doesn't make sense for lay people to try to answer a ton of future medical scenarios or to try to hypothesize about like, well, it depends on if I'm in a car accident or if I get this extra diagnosis or, you know, global pandemic here, but that we think that there are kind of some scale questions to keep in mind. And we would say to answer these with your current mind and body. But, you know, on this scale here, am I worried that I won't get enough care, or am I worried that I'm going to get too much care? There's no right or wrong answer there. And actually, we've seen couples that feel the exact opposite about that. You know, like somebody who doesn't want extreme measures taken and somebody who wants every possible trial and extreme measure taken. That's really important for somebody to know what your values would be. And so we offer a couple of these scale questions to get people thinking, because many times they say, oh, I know I'm supposed to talk about this. I just don't even know what I would say. All I know is like, if I ever get like that, pull the plug. But that's not always the most helpful framing for people. And we'll talk about that plug pulling and give me the whole enchilada. These give you a couple more examples to share so that people can understand what matters to you. And we also think it's really important to make a plan. So soon is not a time like, oh, we should do that soon. That's not that helpful. So we try to lay out kind of the who, what, when are you going to have these conversations. And then we've also included, you know, some thoughts on when to have the conversation. So for us, you know, we always hear that it seems too soon until it's too late. And that we hope these conversations are happening around the kitchen table and not in the ICU. We know that a crisis is a really terrible time to learn. And so this can be good, again, to normalize when somebody turns 18, let's have a conversation about it. If there's a decade or a birthday or major life events happening in someone's life or a trip that somebody's going to go on. My dad went on a motorcycle trip across the country, and we had a conversation about what he would want because that was a pretty high risk event that he was going to be partaking in. And even though we had talked about what he would want if a medical emergency occurred, this was more like, what if you're in a motorcycle accident? How would that change what your wishes are? Or if there's a new diagnosis. So really using any opportunity. People might watch a movie that they really loved and it made them think of something, or like this could be the kind of thing that you talk about once a month, not just something that you save up for once a year. I also like to tell people that every year, April 16th is National Healthcare Decisions Day. It was set up because there's a Benjamin Franklin quote that nothing is certain in life but death and taxes. So April 15th, you do your taxes, and April 16th, you do your advanced care planning, but it can be a chance every year to just kind of revisit what your wishes are and make sure you've talked about it. So we've included different icebreakers of sometimes people say, I know I need to do it, but I don't even have the words of how to introduce the topic. So we've included some icebreakers. And I would say for those of you today, you have the perfect excuse to say, I was joining this call. I learned this interesting thing. It made me realize that I haven't talked to you about X, or I don't know what you would want in this particular situation. And I would definitely recommend taking a look at the guide of how to choose a healthcare proxy, because I find that some people find that to be an easier entree into this. COVID has made me realize that I should really have a healthcare proxy, or in case I'm in an accident and I can't speak for myself, I want to be sure that somebody would know what I want. So can I pick you as my proxy? And then you start to have more conversations about what you would want, because some people are more open to that as the entry point.
Can I pause you for a second and just ask, can you explain the term healthcare proxy for who may not understand what this guide is really used for?
Yes, so a healthcare proxy is the person who you would designate to make medical decisions on your behalf if you're not able to make them for yourself. So if you are physically and mentally able to make your own decisions, you will make your own decisions. But if there's a time, it could be an accident, it could be an illness where maybe somebody has to be intubated or they're put into a medically induced coma where they can't physically speak for themselves. Healthcare system usually would like to know who your proxy is, who you've designated. And there's usually, it varies a little bit by state, which is one reason I don't want to get into all the technical terms. Usually the proxy has to be over the age of 18, in 2 states it's 19. And if you haven't identified somebody formally, there will be a like chain of command that they go to of like spouse, parent, child, you know, in case you have those people who they could ask. This tends to be the topic that people think of with really legal, litigious scenarios of a young, you know, if you think of Terry Schiavo as an example, I think she lived in Florida, where it's like a young woman who was in a coma, vegetative state. Her husband and her parents did not see eye to eye on what should happen, and it was a question of who should the proxy be, who should get to make the call. And so this is one of the things that you can only pick one. You can have some backup people in case that proxy is not available. But really thinking about who do you trust to make decisions on your behalf. And sometimes I know people who said, I don't want it to be my spouse. I want them to be there holding my hand and not feeling like they have to make these decisions. Or I know a young woman who said, I thought I wanted my mom to be my proxy, but I now realize if something happened to me right now, that would be because something devastating had occurred and I don't want to put her in the position of making that call. So I'm going to ask my cousin to do it. So really thinking about, and there's some people who are like, oh, my spouse wouldn't honor my wishes. They want something totally different than what I want. So I want to pick somebody who will honor what I'm asking for. And so that's what this extra tool does, of helping you think through who could really respect what my wishes are. And then we have a guide for how to be a proxy. It's like, okay, somebody's just asked you to do this. How can you be well prepared to do that? I will say that, you know, there's technically a legal form or a medical form that you can fill out. It doesn't require lawyers. None of this requires big, expensive attorneys to do. Different states have requirements of like having a witness, but usually a health system is going to ask for the legal documentation if there is contention in the situation. If it's pretty clear that everybody's on the same page when discussing things, they're going to roll with that. They don't want to cause a lot of trouble, but if there's a lot of family infighting or people kind of swooping in saying, no, mom told me she wanted something totally different in the moment, that's when they're going to say, okay, we need to find out who's legally responsible here. Is that helpful?
Yes, that was great. Thanks so much. I hope I didn't derail you.
No. So a couple of the tips that we have from speaking with people all over the country and around the world when they're doing this is to really think about the role that you want to have in making these decisions. So I've got 2 examples here. One was a woman who I met in Las Vegas who, after doing this whole presentation, at the end of it, she was like, I don't actually care. Like, none of these questions really inspire in me like a real answer that I want somebody to follow. I just want my kids to decide whatever makes them feel best in the moment, which is great, but that's actually a conversation that she needs to have with them rather than never telling her children what she wanted. Something comes up and they say, I don't know, mom never told us, we don't know what she wants. If she could just tell them, I want you guys to decide, that's still a conversation. And then the total opposite end of the spectrum is this woman, Katie Butler, who's an author. She's got a couple of great books, who wrote a letter to her family very specifically about what she would want if she gets dementia or Alzheimer's because of some things that she's seen play out in her family. And you can see here, it is a bulleted list of like, you must do this, 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 and this. I want you to listen to the person writing this letter, not the future state me. And here's like an exact outline of what I want. This letter was super popular. This blog did, you know, thousands of shares because people were sending it to each other saying, oh yeah, I want what she said. But you need to really think about kind of the role that you want to have or how much you care about the type of care you want. For some people, pain management is much more important than the ability to communicate. Other people would rather forego pain meds if it means that they wouldn't be able to talk at the end of life. So you just think about the kind of role that you would want. The next one is to think about the type of care that you're interested in. And this idea of giving current answers, you know, this example here is my husband and I, when we first did this, we had just gotten married. We sat down, we filled out our guides ourselves, and we came back together. And he answered every question as if he was 85 years old with Alzheimer's in a nursing home. And he was a 30-year-old healthy young man. And so it's like, because that's what he had in mind when it came to like, oh, an end of life scenario. Let me think about what my grandparents had. But what I want to normalize is like, no, let's talk now about what you would want if something unexpected occurred. And then when we have a kid, maybe our answers are going to change. Maybe if one of us gets a new diagnosis, our answers will change. But to fill it out with your current body and mind in mind. Another one is this idea of home. That often comes up where people will say, I've had a lot of people come to me in tears of like, my grandmother said the only thing she wanted was to die at home and we couldn't do it. It wasn't financially feasible. She lived on a fifth floor walk up. It wasn't physically feasible. It wasn't medically feasible. Her care got so complex that we had to move her to a facility, and I feel so guilty about that. And to realize that sometimes home isn't only a physical place. For my grandmother, it was that she had her cat with her. She was willing to go anywhere if she could have her cat still with her. For some people, it's I want to be sure that I'm still visited. I want home cooked food. Like, what is it that home? Can you unpack that a little bit more so that people can really honor what's most important? And then this idea of being wary of anybody saying like, oh, if I ever get like that, like give me the whole enchilada or pull the plug. I think that people think that they're being helpful with those conversations, and that it's still helpful to ask a little bit more. Like my dad would be an example of somebody who says, if I ever get like that, pull the plug. To me, that would be say like, it sounds to me like you're concerned about receiving too much care. Like you could go to some of those scale questions to understand a little bit more about what that means. And to be careful. I know there's some people who worry, like, I don't want somebody to give up on me. If I'm in there and I'm blinking, I'm giving it a fighting chance. I want you to do everything you can, and to avoid that fear of being given up on. And so I hope that nobody ever hears from a clinician, there's nothing more we can do, because that's not correct. Somebody might be able to they might not be able to pursue treatment and curative care anymore, but they could still be doing aggressive comfort care. And so helping think along those lines of, are you interested in aggressive comfort care, aggressive treatment, can be helpful with thinking about the kind of care. It's also helpful to think about the roles others might play. So particularly for blended families, we've shared some of those examples. I remember a woman saying that she and her husband had these conversations. She knew exactly what he wanted, but she was the second wife and he had adult children, and she realized he'd never told the adult children. She was like, it would start World War III if I'm suddenly in the hospital setting making decisions for their dad. But he could just cut that off right now by telling them, while he's still able to speak, while there's no medical emergency, hey guys, I've talked to Susan. She knows what I want. I hope that you'll follow what her lead is, because we've talked about it a lot. That makes the clinician's job so much easier. It makes the familial relations that much better. There was a great story of a woman in Hawaii, it's kind of like Just Right, her Goldilocks story, where she did this professionally. She knew she wanted to pick her proxy, and she asked her husband if he would be the proxy, and he was just like, oh no, I could never let you go. I'll keep you basically hooked up to any machine that would let me sit by your side and hold your hand, even if you're not responsive, for 20 years. She's like, well, that's not really what I want. So she asked her son, who said, got it, Mom, you don't want a single medical intervention ever taken. I'll never let them hook you up to life support of any kind. Like, you're good to go. And she's like, nope. Her oldest daughter couldn't even talk to her about it. She was just in tears the entire time. And so she went to her youngest daughter, who had been her like fourth choice originally in thinking about who her proxy would be. And that daughter totally got it and sat down and listened to her and said, okay, I understand that depending on your prognosis, you might be willing to try a bit of extra intervention for a little while, but if it doesn't look like you'd be able to do these things, then you don't want extreme measure taken. So that became who she chose as her proxy. I've heard of folks who didn't have a natural fit. They didn't have their solo agers. They didn't have family around. They didn't have friends that they felt that they could turn to. And there was a program happening at a church in Boston. There were two women in that same situation. And so they became each other's proxies. So to find somebody else who's kind of willing to play that role can be helpful. We know it's really important to tell more than one person. we talk about the seagull effect, where you might be the person caring for a loved one, and then you get a sibling from out of town who comes in at the last minute and dumps all over the whole plan and swoops back out to California. So in my grandparents' case, that idea that my mom was the proxy, but they had told the other children that my mom was the proxy. Even just that alone, so that 7 different people don't think that they're supposed to be the one making the call, can go a long way. It's really helpful to be careful and beware of caregiver kind of bullying. There was a woman in Florida who was attending one of our events, and she got up in tears and she was like, I owe my father a tremendous apology. I just realized, she listed off a lot of medical conditions he has, and he really wasn't doing well last night, and he wouldn't go to the hospital. And my siblings and I were laying it on so thick, showing up at his house, texting him, calling him why he needed to go to the hospital. And I'm realizing now he's trying to tell us something about the care that he wants, and we have not been listening. And so I'm texting him now, we need a family meeting this afternoon, like, let's find out what he wants. So I think that's really an important thing to keep in mind. And there are some people who don't really want to talk about this, or they're not entirely sure how to talk about it. As an example, I could say Eeyore here from Winnie the Pooh, of a woman whose husband was just kind of like mopey and never wanted to talk about it whenever she brought it up. And so she said, okay, here's what I think you would want if you couldn't speak for yourself. Can you tell me if that's right? And he was able to be like, kind of, but maybe I would change this one thing. So just trying to think about ways you might be telling people what your wishes are, but also listening from them what their wishes are, and really including them in both directions. And just noting that there's really a chance for this to strengthen relationships. I know that there are often tears, but we hear so many times about laughter and fun, loving stories that people share of people in their life can be very rewarding and kind of contagious. Like, you start to have the conversation. If that goes well, you start to talk about it with friends. If you can help be one of the people who help to normalize this in your social or familial world, it can go a long way to strengthen those relationships. 2 things that have come out of some messaging research at the Massachusetts Coalition for Serious Illness Care is that there are all different types of people and how they react to this topic. And 2 pieces of messaging that really seem to resonate the most across all different kinds of people is this idea that conversations clarify, that we can't control everything that's going to happen, but a form of kind of conditional control that we could have is to clarify what we would want. And rather than just assuming my mom knows what I want or my sister knows what I want, I can have conversations to help clarify that and answer any questions. And this idea of kind of demanding shared decision-making, that we can and should have a say in our care. And actually, medical providers often really appreciate knowing what somebody would want. And so, Atul Gawande often talks about how people will say to him, well, I don't know, doc, what would you do if this was your mom? He's like, I don't know. My mom loves ballroom dancing and this, and this. Like, what did your mom like to do? What would be a good day for her? What does success look like? Understanding more about you as a person can really help people make decisions on your behalf. So with this idea of listening, or that conversations clarify, this is an email that we got this spring, and I'll just jump to the punch of it, but it was somebody who was going to visit her grandparents. She'd been really worried about them as it related to dementia, and they were living on their own, and she was really nervous about that, and really kind of tried to push it before. And while she was flying out there, she looked at our conversation guides, and rather than telling them how worried she was, telling them what she thought she could do, she started to ask them questions and really having a 2-way conversation. And in the end, they assigned her the healthcare proxy. They were willing to move to assisted living. And so this idea of being sure that we listen to what people are telling us and not just imposing on them what we think they should want is really important. So my hope for today would be that you would take a look at the conversation guide, maybe complete that, pick your person, have the conversation with them. Maybe you get to the point of documenting that, or bringing this concept back to your world, whatever that might be, where you live, work, pray, learn, your family and friends. And also want to share this idea that we've talked about conversation as it relates to speaking, but a lot of people find it easier to put things in writing. And this is a letter from, you can see kind of the handwritten version. I included a little screenshot of from a physician who was part of our original team that we brought this idea to. And she was so drawn to the concept that she started to write a letter out to her daughters while we were meeting. Because if you're faced with a decision that you're not ready for, it's okay. I'll try to let you know what I would want for various circumstances. But if you come to something we haven't anticipated, it's okay. And if you come to a decision point and what you decide results in my death, it's okay. You don't need to worry that you've caused my death. You haven't. I will die because of my illness or my body failing or whatever. You don't need to feel responsible. Forgiveness is not required. But if you feel bad, responsible, guilty, first of all, don't. And second of all, you are loved and forgiven. If you are faced with a snap decision, don't panic. Choose comfort, choose home, choose less intervention, choose to be together at my side, holding my hand, singing, laughing, loving, celebrating, and carrying on. I will keep loving you and watching you and being proud of you. And I think of what a gift this is to her children to have in her handwriting a note that says, don't panic, you're forgiven, you are not causing my death by making certain decisions here. And I remember another woman whose son was saying, Mom, I can't do it. I can't make these choices for you. And she says, I'm making the choice. I just need you to be my voice. You know, that's part of what these conversations are, is that it reduces, we know that it reduces depression for caregivers or survivors after the loss of a loved one if they've had these conversations. And that there will most oftentimes be grief, but how complicated that grief is, of questioning, did I do the right thing? Why am I now fighting with my sister? You know, the complexity of that grief can just be so greatly alleviated that that's really our goal in doing this. So I hope that that is helpful. There's ways to kind of stay involved with us, you know, following us on social if you're interested in doing more stuff in the community setting. And then I put my contact information here if you have questions, but would love to just kind of open it up and see what kind of questions people might have, or if there's anything else I can help answer or talk about.
That letter was beautiful, Kate. I feel like I should have put a you may cry disclaimer on this webinar, because I'm sure several people teared up. I know I did when you read that. And thank you for sharing. I mean, there have been so many helpful tips and, as you've said, like points to be aware of in this topic, you know, from asking as opposed to telling, from including your healthcare professional in the discussion, and also what you just mentioned, which is the grief and how this decision or this process not only impacts your care and how you live through the end of life, but how it impacts those after we've all passed away. So yeah, so many great pieces of information there. I haven't seen any questions come in, but I did have a question. I was curious if you have any additional insight, or if you could share a little bit more about when people are working with a healthcare provider. Maybe, you know, a lot of our community members have very close relationships with their primary care providers because they see them so regularly, and they've developed a partnership in learning about FOP and, you know, providing optimal care. What are some of the questions or ways that that healthcare provider can kind of bring their expertise into that discussion and help the individual living with FOP kind of frame maybe what some of their specific needs may be?
So there's two guides, and I'm realizing, I hope you and I can also be in touch too, of like what are some additional resources to share, like the guide for like living with serious illness, or one about how to talk to a healthcare team. I think the idea of identifying who a proxy might be and bringing them alongside for certain appointments or meetings, if that's appropriate. If you say, like, I've got my sister here with me, I really want her to hear what we're talking about, that can be good. And the flip side can be, if you don't want your sister in the room, and she usually is, and you say, I really want a chance to talk to my doctor alone, to reach out to the practice ahead of time to say, I would love to talk, you know, my sister's going to be with me. I would love to have a chance to talk to Dr. Jones. Can you have him ask her to step out at some point? That there's really kind of looking and deciding how much you want the clinicians to share. So that's actually a scale question. There are some people for whom they would rather have a prognosis. I want the best estimation of how long I have to live. And then other people who absolutely don't want to know that information. And so being really clear with your provider of where you fall on that spectrum and thinking about some of these scale questions so that they can be really aware of, I would love for my family and friends to be totally kept in the loop versus I feel very private about this and I don't want you to share with them. Or I do or don't want to know prognosis. Those are the kinds of things that I think a clinician can find to be really helpful. And then similarly, like what are the goals or what are important things that they should know about you when making choices? How much is cost? Like cost comes up a lot. There are a lot of people who are more concerned about the cost of treatment than they are about death. Like when you look at the concerns people have. And so if that's something that's a really important factor for your clinician to know, that's a really important thing to talk about and to normalize airing whatever it is that matters most to you, to be sure that they're aware of that. I see Holly's question of, is it recommended to work with an attorney in order to create a legal document that would include the healthcare proxy? I guess I would say, Holly, yes and no. So I wouldn't want somebody to wait to designate a healthcare proxy until they can see an estate attorney and save money to have those conversations. And I don't think it's a bad thing to do. So every state has a free healthcare proxy form that you can fill out, or a living will form that you can fill out. You can answer certain questions. I think caringinfo.org is a website that has a ton of that information of like every state's document. And as I mentioned before, sometimes all it takes is having 2 witnesses watch you sign it to say, yep, I've picked this person. You can only fill out the part about who your healthcare proxy is, or you could fill out some additional documentation of like, do you want CPR? Do you want certain life-saving measures? So you could do that and get that on file in your doctor's office this week. So, and an estate attorney, and you know what, a lot of clinicians would say that's good enough as long as people are having these conversations. That's really what we need to have happen. An estate attorney would probably tell you all the horror stories they've heard of when things weren't entirely clear or totally buttoned up, but I will tell you that no attorney is going to be able to walk through every hypothetical scenario that could come up. And so for them, many times we work with a lot of attorneys who use our guides kind of in hand to say, yes, get this on file, and again, don't let it sit in the filing cabinet. You need to talk about this so that those wishes are known. I hope that helps. And even during COVID, when people weren't able to get notarized documents, like even sending an email to all the important people in life saying, hey, I picked Susan as my proxy. She and I have talked about this. Like there is some written documentation or acknowledgement of who has been chosen can really go a long way. Or that idea of, I talked to my husband about what I want, but I'm also going to tell my sister and my mom so that they know that he's up to speed. Like just normalizing telling people goes a really long way in terms of any legal issues or challenges. That said, if you know you've got a contentious family dynamic, or if there's, I'm trying to think of some of the scenarios we've heard. Sometimes if somebody's a single parent, or there's just kind of like some dynamics where it could get a little more complicated, that might be all the more reason to get an attorney involved to kind of lay out some of the complexities. I'm going to type it from the top of my head, caringinfo.org. I think that is the site where they should have state documents. It's like almost every state's attorney general's website will have it. You're basically looking for a healthcare proxy or a living will or an advanced directive form in your state. And most hospital systems will also have it. So you could always ask your doctor. I know, I was having a child, and before I went into labor, they had a healthcare proxy form for me to fill out to say, in case something happens. But that's the fear. My mother-in-law at one point was like, oh yeah, I had shoulder surgery 13 years ago and I had to fill out one of these things. I'm sure my doctor still has it on file. I was like, oh, that is way too much trust in the healthcare system to still have a paper document from 13 years ago on file. So I tend to err on the side of continuing to update it, make sure things are on file, people know where to access documents.
That's a great point that we kind of touched on in our conversation, is that updating forms, it's certainly to just highlight, I know you've mentioned this throughout the webinar, but that it's not a one and done thing. It's whether it's the conversation you're having with people or the document themselves, there are things for people to continue to come back and revisit. And I'll post that, the website that Kate mentioned on the page with the recording of this, so people can easily find it there as well.
We often joke that this should have been the conversations project, because it is not something that you do one time. And people change who their proxy is for a variety of reasons. And so rather than shredding an old document, you might write on the cover of it, updated August 15th, 2021, new proxy is, like, it doesn't hurt to create a paper trail on things, again, especially if you think there would be a challenge or a concern. But hopefully by having a lot of these conversations, you head that off. And yes, to your point, I'm equally driven by this work about the experience for the person or the patient who might not be able to speak for themselves. And again, it isn't always an end of life scenario where that's the case. So I want the best for that person. And I'm really driven by what is the experience for the people who survived that person and how to help them feel supported and to reduce a lot of that anticipatory grief or conflict that could come afterwards.
That is beautiful. It really brings it full circle of your life, but also, the lives of those who will live on after you. And Kate, you did a beautiful job of covering all of this, and the Conversation Project has amazing resources. So I thank you for being the bridge that connected our community to those amazing guides. And it's just been a pleasure. I don't see any other questions coming in. So with that, we will say thanks to everyone who joined, who listened in today. And like I said, a recording of this webinar will be available later this week. Thanks again, Kate, for joining us.
Thank you all.